The boarding pass trembled in Marco's small hands. Gate 12. The numbers blurred together like ink dropped in water, twisting and rearranging themselves until they meant nothing at all. He'd been staring at the piece of paper for 3 minutes now, standing in the middle of O'Hare International Airport's Terminal 3, while thousands of people rushed past him like he was invisible. His backpack, too big for his 7-year-old frame, dug into his shoulders. Inside were 3 days' worth of clothes, a stuffed rabbit named Buttons that he'd never admit he still slept with, and a note from his grandmother that he couldn't read either. The airport was overwhelming. Voices echoed off the high ceilings in a dozen different languages. Overhead announcements crackled through speakers every few seconds. The smell of coffee and fast food mixed with something chemical and strange. Marco had never been anywhere this loud, this bright, this terrifying. His mother was supposed to be here. She'd promised she would meet him at the gate, that everything would be okay, that this time would be different. But she wasn't answering her phone, and Marco didn't know what to do except stand here, clutching his boarding pass, trying to make sense of letters that refused to stay still. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. A woman in a business suit nearly knocked him over, her rolling suitcase missing his foot by inches. She didn't apologize, didn't even look back. Marco pressed himself against the wall near a closed coffee shop, trying to be smaller, trying to disappear. His grandmother had put him on the plane in Phoenix that morning with tears in her eyes and promises that Mama would be waiting in Chicago. But Grandma didn't know about the letters, about how they danced and jumped when Marco tried to read them. She didn't know that he'd been hiding it for 2 years, pretending, memorizing, asking other kids what things said without letting them know he couldn't read it himself. The gate numbers stretched down the terminal like a secret code he'd never been taught to break. Gate 1, Gate 3, Gate 5. He knew those were numbers. He'd memorized what they looked like. But Gate 12 could be anywhere, and Marco was lost. A security guard walked past, and Marco almost called out to him, but shame kept his mouth closed. What if the guard got mad? What if he asked why a 7-year-old couldn't read his own boarding pass? What if he called someone, and Marco got in trouble, and they sent him back to Phoenix where Grandma was already crying because she couldn't take care of him anymore? 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Marco's legs hurt from standing. His stomach growled, but he'd already eaten the sandwich Grandma packed, eaten it on the plane because he was nervous and eating made the nervousness smaller for a little while. Now he had nothing. No food, no water, no idea where to go. He looked at his boarding pass again, hoping that maybe this time the letters would make sense, that maybe if he just tried hard enough, they'd stop moving. But they didn't. They never did. That's when he saw him. A man in a black suit, expensive looking, the kind Marco had only seen in movies. He was tall, maybe 40, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile a long time ago. He walked with purpose, with certainty, with 2 other men flanking him like shadows. They moved through the crowd, and the crowd moved for them, instinctively creating space as if they could sense something dangerous, something powerful. The man in the middle, the one who was clearly in charge, had his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in Italian, his voice low and controlled but carrying an edge of steel that made Marco shiver even from a distance. Marco shouldn't have approached him. Every instinct told him this man was not someone to bother, not someone safe. But desperation has its own logic, and Marco was desperate. He stepped away from the wall, his small legs carrying him into the man's path before his brain could stop him. The 2 men flanking the leader noticed him first, their hands moving instinctively toward their jackets in a gesture Marco didn't understand. But the man in the middle held up one hand, stopping them, and ended his phone call mid-sentence. "Excuse me," Marco said, his voice barely above a whisper, drowned out by an overhead announcement about a delayed flight to Miami. He tried again, louder. "Excuse me, mister." The man looked down at him, and Marco almost ran. The man's eyes were dark, almost black, and they held a kind of intensity that made Marco feel like he was being X-rayed, like this stranger could see every secret he'd ever kept. But there was something else there too, something that kept Marco from bolting. Not quite kindness, but a focused attention that made him feel, for the first time all day, like someone actually saw him. My ticket says Gate 12, Marco said, holding up his boarding pass with both hands, his voice shaking. But I can't read. The words came out in a rush, the shame of them burning his cheeks red. I can't read, and I don't know where to go, and my mom is supposed to meet me, but I can't find the gate, and the letters, they move around, and I can't. His voice cracked, and he realized he was crying, tears spilling down his face in front of this terrifying stranger and his terrifying friends, and he couldn't stop. The man stared at him for what felt like an eternity. The two men flanking him exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond. The airport continued its chaos around them, thousands of people rushing to catch flights, to leave, to arrive, to move forward with their lives. But in this small pocket of space, time seemed to pause. The man crouched down slowly, bringing himself to Marco's eye level, his expensive suit creasing as his knees touched the airport floor. Up close, Marco could see the lines around his eyes, the weariness there, the weight of something heavy and old. "What's your name?" the man asked. His voice was different than Marco expected. Not harsh, but not quite gentle either. Careful. Controlled. Marco. Marco Delgado. The man's expression flickered, something passing across his face too quickly for Marco to identify. He took the boarding pass from Marco's hands, his movements precise and deliberate. "Gate 12 is that way," he said, pointing down the terminal. "Past the bookstore, past the sushi restaurant, third gate on the left after the bathrooms." He handed the pass back. "Your mother will be there?" Marco nodded, though he wasn't sure anymore. He wasn't sure of anything except that this man had just done something no one else had bothered to do all day. He'd stopped. He'd looked. He'd helped. "Thank you," Marco whispered. The man stood, and for a moment Marco thought that would be it, that this strange, intense person would walk away and disappear into the crowd like everyone else. But instead, the man made a decision that Marco wouldn't understand until much later. "We'll walk you there," the man said, not asking, simply stating. He gestured to one of his companions, a younger man with sharp eyes who immediately pulled out his phone and made a call. "Call Benetti. Tell him we'll be 10 minutes late." They walked through the terminal together, this odd group. The man in the expensive suit, his two companions, and a small 7-year-old boy with a backpack too big for him and a secret he'd just revealed to a stranger. People noticed them. How could they not? The man commanded attention without trying, and having a child with him only made the image stranger, more noteworthy. Marco kept close, afraid that if he fell behind even a step, he'd lose them, lose this unexpected protection, lose the first person who'd actually helped him today. "You said the letters move around," the man said as they walked, his voice matter-of-fact, like they were discussing the weather. "When you try to read them." Marco nodded, embarrassed again. The man continued, "That's called dyslexia. It's not that you can't learn to read. It's that your brain processes letters differently than other people's brains do. It's not your fault." The words landed on Marco like a revelation. Not his fault. He'd spent 2 years thinking he was stupid, broken, wrong. His teacher had given up on him. The other kids whispered about him. Even Grandma, who loved him, got frustrated when he couldn't read the bedtime stories she tried to share. But this stranger, this intimidating man in a suit that probably cost more than Grandma's car, was telling him it wasn't his fault. They reached Gate 12. The waiting area was half empty, the flight to wherever Marco was going still an hour from boarding. Marco scanned the faces, looking for his mother, for her dark curly hair and bright smile, for the woman who'd promised she'd be here. But she wasn't. The seats held strangers. Travelers scrolling on phones, sleeping with jackets pulled over their faces, drinking coffee and staring at departure boards. No one who looked like they were waiting for him. No one who looked like his mother. "She's not here," Marco said, the panic rising in his chest again. "She said she'd be here, but she's not here." The man pulled out his phone, his expression unreadable. "What's your mother's name?" "Elena." Elena Delgado. One of the companions, the one who'd made the earlier call, stepped closer. Boss, we really need to. The man held up one finger, silencing him instantly. He dialed a number, spoke rapidly in Italian again, giving instructions Marco couldn't understand. Then he turned back to Marco. We're going to find your mother. But first, have you eaten? Marco shook his head, though it was a lie. He'd eaten hours ago, and he was starving, but he didn't want to be trouble. He'd learned early that being trouble made people leave. But the man saw through it immediately. He handed his phone to the younger companion and addressed the other one. Nico, get him food. Something a child actually eats. Before Marco could protest, Nico had disappeared into the terminal and returned minutes later with a kid's meal from McDonald's, apple slices, and a bottle of water. The man gestured to a seat, and Marco sat, the bag of food in his lap. He looked up at this stranger who'd stopped his important day to help a lost boy who couldn't read, and something in his chest cracked open. Why are you helping me? Marco asked. The man sat down beside him, and his two companions stood at a respectful distance, watching the crowd with the alertness of people trained to spot danger. Because no one helped me when I was your age, the man said finally. And I remember what that felt like. They sat in silence while Marco ate. The man made more calls, his voice never rising, but carrying an authority that suggested people jumped when he spoke. Marco heard names, instructions, something about finding an Elena Delgado who was supposed to be at O'Hare. After the third call, the man's expression darkened. He stood, walked a few feet away, and had a conversation in rapid Italian that sounded like an argument, though his volume never increased. When he returned, his face was carefully neutral. Marco, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. When was the last time you actually spoke to your mother? The question made Marco's stomach hurt. This morning. Before I got on the plane. She called Grandma's phone. That was a lie. He hadn't spoken to her in 3 weeks. But saying it out loud, admitting that his mother had stopped calling, stopped answering, stopped being reachable, felt like admitting something terrible about himself, like maybe he was the reason she'd disappeared. The man studied him for a long moment, and Marco had the horrible feeling that this stranger could see right through his lie, could see all the way down to the scared, abandoned part of him that he tried so hard to hide. My people are making calls, the man said carefully. We'll find her. An hour passed. Then 2. Marco's flight began boarding, families and business travelers lining up at the gate desk, showing their passes, disappearing down the jet bridge. Marco stayed in his seat, watching them leave, watching his chance to get wherever he was supposed to go vanish one passenger at a time. The man had moved away to make more calls, his expression growing darker with each conversation. Finally, he returned, crouched down again to Marco's level. Marco, I need to tell you something, and it's not easy to hear. Marco's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. He already knew. Somewhere deep down, he'd known since the moment he'd arrived and his mother wasn't waiting. She's not coming, is she? Marco's voice was small, flat, empty. We found her, the man said, and the gentleness in his voice was somehow worse than if he'd been harsh. She's in a facility. A place where people go when they need help with certain problems. She checked herself in 4 days ago. She's safe, but she's not in a position to take care of you right now. The words should have hurt more than they did. Maybe Marco had used up all his hurt already. Maybe he'd been preparing for this moment for longer than he realized. So what happens to me? The man looked at him for a long time. Something was happening behind those dark eyes, some kind of calculation or decision being made that Marco couldn't read. When he spoke, his voice carried a finality that suggested the decision, whatever it was already made. What happens is you don't go back to Phoenix tonight, the man said. What happens is you come with me until we figure out what's next. My name is Dante Carbone, and I'm going to make sure you're safe. Marco should have been scared. This stranger, this Dante Carbone with his expensive suit and his dangerous-looking friends, was essentially telling him he was taking him. But Marco wasn't scared. He was tired. Tired of being lost, tired of trying to make sense of letters that wouldn't stay still, tired of waiting for a mother who'd promised to be there and wasn't. If this stranger wanted to help him, wanted to make sure he was safe, then maybe that was enough for now. Okay, Marco said, and the word felt like surrender and relief all at once. Dante Carbone stood, made one more phone call, and within 20 minutes, Marco's life had shifted onto a completely different track. Calls were made to social services, to emergency custody systems, to lawyers who spoke in rapid legal terms that Marco couldn't follow. Dante had resources, connections, power that moved through phone lines and made things happen that shouldn't have been possible. By the time the sun set outside the airport windows, Marco was in the back of a black car, driving through Chicago streets lined with buildings taller than anything in Phoenix, heading toward a destination he knew nothing about with a man he'd met only hours ago. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The car was silent except for the low murmur of Italian from the front seat, where Nico was driving and speaking on a Bluetooth headset. Dante sat beside Marco in the back, his attention on his phone, responding to messages with the focused efficiency of someone who ran an empire. Marco stared out the window, watching Chicago slide past, and wondered what kind of life he'd just fallen into. The buildings grew taller, the streets cleaner, the cars more expensive. They crossed a bridge over black water that reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds. Then they turned onto a private street lined with trees that had been planted deliberately, uniformly, guarding estates that hid behind iron gates and stone walls. The car stopped in front of one such gate. Nico pressed a button on a remote, and the gate slid open silently, revealing a circular driveway and a house that Marco could only describe as a mansion. It was 3 stories of pale stone and dark windows, illuminated by landscape lighting that made it look like something from a movie. The front door was massive, dark wood with iron fixtures. As they pulled up, the door opened, and a woman in her 50s emerged, her face creased with concern. "Dante," she said in accented English as he stepped out of the car. "You said nothing about a child." "This is Marco," Dante said, helping him out of the car. Marco's backpack caught on the seatbelt, and Dante untangled it with surprising patience. "He'll be staying with us until other arrangements can be made." The woman, who Dante introduced as Sophia, the housekeeper, looked at Marco with an expression that was part sympathy, part worry. "A child, Dante. Here?" There was a weight to her words, an implication Marco didn't understand. Dante's expression hardened. "Here. Now show him to the East Wing guest room. He'll need food, clean clothes, and someone to explain to him that he's safe." Sophia's face softened as she looked at Marco. "Come, little one. Let's get you settled." Marco followed her inside, through a foyer with marble floors and a chandelier that hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks. The house was immaculate, cold in its perfection, more like a museum than a home. They climbed a wide staircase, walked down a hallway lined with doors, and entered a bedroom that was bigger than the entire apartment Marco had shared with his grandmother in Phoenix. The bed was enormous, covered in white linens. The furniture was dark wood, heavy and expensive. A window overlooked the backyard, where Marco could see the silhouette of trees and, beyond them, the glow of the city. "The bathroom is through there," Sophia said, pointing to a door. "I'll bring you something to eat. Do you need anything else?" Marco shook his head, overwhelmed. After Sophia left, he sat on the edge of the bed, his feet not quite touching the floor, and tried to process what had happened today. He'd left Phoenix this morning. He'd gotten lost in an airport. A stranger had helped him. His mother wasn't coming. And now he was in a mansion in Chicago with a man named Dante Carbone who spoke Italian and made things happen with phone calls. It felt like a dream, the kind that would evaporate when he woke up. But the bed was real beneath him. The expensive smell of the room, like leather and something floral, was real. The ache in his chest when he thought about his mother was real. Sophia returned with a tray, chicken fingers and fries, food Marco recognized and could eat without thinking. She sat with him while he ate, asking gentle questions about where he was from, how old he was, what he liked. Marco answered carefully, still not sure if he was safe, still not sure if this was the kind of help that would disappear like everything else. When he was done, Sophia showed him the bathroom, where she'd laid out towels and a toothbrush still in its package. There are clothes in the closet that should fit you. I'll have more brought tomorrow. Marco wanted to ask how she had clothes that fit him already, but he was too tired to form the question. After Sophia left, he brushed his teeth, changed into pajamas that were too big but clean, and climbed into the enormous bed. He thought he wouldn't be able to sleep in this strange place, in this room that felt like it belonged to someone important, not a 7-year-old boy who couldn't read and whose mother didn't want him. But exhaustion won, and Marco fell asleep almost immediately, his small body lost in the vast bed. Downstairs, Dante Carbone stood in his office, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows. His second-in-command, Antonio, sat across from him, reviewing the day's reports. The shipment from Marseille arrived on time. The meeting with the Calabrese family is confirmed for Thursday. And the issue with the East Side territory has been resolved. Dante nodded, his mind only half on the business. The other half was upstairs, in the East Wing guest room, where a 7-year-old boy with dyslexia and an absent mother was sleeping in a bed meant for guests, not children. Antonio noticed. The boy. What are you planning to do with him? Dante took a long drink, the whiskey burning down his throat. I don't know yet. That was a lie. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He'd known the moment Marco had looked up at him in that airport with tears streaming down his face and said, I can't read. He'd known because he'd seen himself in that child, seen the shame, the fear, the desperate need for someone to help that he'd felt when he was young and alone and convinced he was broken. This isn't a good idea, Antonio said carefully. Bringing a child into this world, into this life. You know what we are. You know what we do. Dante set his glass down with a sharp click. What I know is that boy has nothing. No mother who can care for him. No father in the picture. A grandmother in Phoenix who's too old and too poor to raise him. He was lost in an airport, terrified and alone, and everyone who walked past him saw him and chose to do nothing. So yes, I know what we are. I also know what we can be when it matters. Antonio was silent for a moment, then nodded. He'd known Dante for 20 years, had seen him build this empire from nothing, had watched him make decisions that were ruthless, calculated, and occasionally brutal. But he'd also seen the code Dante lived by, the strange honor that governed his actions. I'll make sure the house is safe for a child. No business conducted here while he's present. No weapons visible. No, Dante interrupted. He stays in the East Wing. Business continues as normal. But he's protected, Antonio. Anyone who touches that boy, anyone who uses him as leverage, anyone who even thinks about harming him answers to me directly. Spread the word. The edge in his voice made it clear this wasn't a request. Antonio nodded and left. Dante finished his whiskey and climbed the stairs to the second floor. He paused outside the East Wing guest room, the door slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see Marco sleeping, curled on his side, his small body nearly invisible in the large bed. Dante had built an empire on control, on power, on the ability to make hard decisions without hesitation. But standing in the hallway, watching this child sleep, he felt something crack in the armor he'd spent decades building. He'd lied to Marco. He'd lied when he said they'd find his mother, when he'd implied things would be okay, when he'd suggested this was temporary. The truth was darker, more complicated. Elena Delgado was in a facility, yes, but she'd been in and out of facilities for years. Drug addiction had destroyed her life piece by piece, and she'd given up on trying to be a mother long before today. The grandmother was dying, cancer eating through her body faster than the doctors could treat it. Marco had no one. No family who could take him, no system that would care about one more lost boy. He would end up in foster care, bounced from home to home, lost in a system that would fail him as thoroughly as everyone else had. Dante could prevent that. He could keep Marco here, could give him safety and stability and resources. He could make sure the boy learned to read, got proper help for his dyslexia, had opportunities that his broken family could never provide. But in doing so, he would also pull Marco into his world, the world of the Carbone family, the world of organized crime, violence, power, and darkness. It was a choice that felt both selfless and selfish. Selfless because Dante genuinely wanted to help. Selfish because Marco reminded him of someone he'd lost, a younger brother who'd died because Dante hadn't been there to protect him. He closed the door quietly and walked to his own room, where he stood at the window and watched the city breathe in the night, lights flickering on and off like heartbeats, and wondered if saving one lost boy could possibly make up for all the things he'd done, all the darkness he'd created, all the souls his empire had destroyed. Marco woke to silence so complete it felt unnatural. In Phoenix, mornings came with the sound of traffic on the street below, grandma's television playing too loud through thin walls, neighbors arguing or laughing or living their lives in apartments stacked like boxes. Here, in Dante's mansion, silence was a luxury, thick and heavy as the expensive curtains blocking out the dawn. For a moment, Marco forgot where he was. Then memory crashed back, the airport, the man who'd helped him, his mother who hadn't come. He sat up in the massive bed, his small frame dwarfed by white linens that probably cost more than everything his grandmother owned. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sophia entered carrying folded clothes, her expression warmer than it had been last night. "Good morning, Marco. I thought you might need these." She laid out jeans that looked his size, a soft gray sweater, socks, underwear still in packages. "How did you sleep?" Marco nodded, not trusting his voice yet. Sophia moved to the windows and pulled back the curtains, revealing a backyard that stretched impossibly far, manicured grass giving way to gardens and then trees, a small world contained within high stone walls. "Mr. Carbone would like you to join him for breakfast when you're ready. Take your time getting dressed. The dining room is downstairs, first door on the left past the foyer." After she left, Marco dressed slowly, the clothes fitting perfectly in a way that felt intentional, planned. Someone had known his size, had prepared for him before he'd even arrived. The thought should have comforted him but instead made him feel like a piece being moved on a board, part of a game he didn't understand. He made his way downstairs, his footsteps silent on thick carpet, and found the dining room exactly where Sophia had said. The table could have seated 20 people easily, dark wood polished to a mirror shine, but only 2 places were set, one at the head and one to the right. Dante sat in the head position, reading something on his phone, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. He looked different in daylight, somehow more real and more dangerous at once. "Sit," Dante said, gesturing to the chair beside him without looking up. Marco obeyed. Moments later, Sophia appeared with plates, scrambled eggs, toast, bacon, orange juice in a crystal glass. Food Marco recognized, prepared perfectly. He ate slowly, aware of Dante's presence beside him, the way the man radiated authority even in silence. Finally, Dante set down his phone and turned his attention fully to Marco. "We need to talk about what happens next." Marco's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Your grandmother called this morning. She's in the hospital. The cancer has progressed faster than her doctors anticipated. She has weeks, maybe less." The eggs turned to ash in Marco's mouth. Grandma had been sick for months, but she'd always said she was fine, always promised she'd beat it, always acted like everything would work out. Now she had weeks. "And your mother," Dante continued, his voice carefully neutral, "is going to be in treatment for at least 6 months. Even after that, she'll need intensive support to maintain sobriety. The reality is she won't be able to care for you for a very long time, if ever." Marco set down his fork, his appetite gone. He'd known this, somewhere deep down, but hearing it stated so plainly made it impossible to deny. "So I go into foster care," he said flatly, repeating words he'd heard adults use when they thought he wasn't listening. Dante was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying Marco with an intensity that felt like being X-rayed. "There's another option." He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. "You stay here. With me. I become your legal guardian. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and terrifying and somehow exactly what Marco needed. "Why would you do that?" Marco asked. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Dante's expression flickered, something old and painful crossing his face before he controlled it. "Because I had a younger brother once. His name was Luca. He was 5 years younger than me, and he had the same learning difficulties you have. Letters confused him. Reading was torture. Our father didn't understand, didn't believe it was real. He thought Luca was lazy, stupid, weak." Dante's jaw tightened, and Marco could see the effort it took him to continue. "When I was 17, I left home. I was angry, reckless, convinced I could build something better than the life our father offered. I told Luca I'd come back for him, that I'd make enough money to get us both out. But I was too slow. Our father's patience ran out. He sent Luca to a school, the kind where they break you until you fit their mold. Luca lasted 3 months before he hanged himself in a closet with his belt. He was 12 years old." The story landed on Marco like a physical weight. He didn't know what to say, didn't have words for the kind of pain Dante was describing. "I'm not trying to replace him," Dante said quietly. "I can't. But I can make sure what happened to him doesn't happen to you. I can give you resources, protection, a chance to become whoever you're meant to be without the world crushing you first." Marco looked down at his plate, at eggs grown cold and toast he couldn't eat. Everything in his short life had been temporary. Homes, schools, promises. People who said they'd stay and then left. His father had disappeared before he was born. His mother loved drugs more than she loved him. Grandma tried but was dying. Why would this be any different? "What if you change your mind?" Marco asked, his voice small. "What if you decide I'm too much trouble?" Dante leaned forward, elbows on the table, bringing himself closer to Marco's level. "I don't change my mind, Marco. When I commit to something, I see it through. If you agree to this, you're mine to protect. That's not temporary. That's permanent." The weight of the promise settled over Marco, and he realized he was crying again, tears spilling down his face for the second time in front of this dangerous stranger who was offering him something that felt like salvation. "Okay," Marco whispered. "Okay, I'll stay." Dante nodded once, and something in his expression softened imperceptibly. "Then we'll start the paperwork today. It will take time, but I have lawyers who can expedite things. In the meantime, you're safe here. This is your home now." He stood, placed a hand briefly on Marco's shoulder, a gesture that felt awkward but genuine, then left the dining room. Marco sat alone at the massive table, surrounded by luxury he didn't understand, protected by a man he barely knew, and felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not quite hope, but close. Maybe the possibility of hope. The first weeks were strange, a careful dance of adjustment. Dante hired a tutor, a patient woman named Dr. Chen who specialized in dyslexia. She came 3 times a week, bringing tools and techniques that made letters stay still, that taught Marco his brain wasn't broken, just different. She used colored overlays, special fonts, multisensory approaches. Reading was still hard, but for the first time in his life, Marco began to believe it was possible. The house operated on schedules Marco slowly learned. Breakfast at 8. Tutoring sessions at 9. Lunch at 1. Afternoons were his own, to explore the grounds or read with Dr. Chen's help or simply exist in a space that was safe and predictable. Evenings, Dante usually had business, meetings in his office with men who spoke in low voices and left through side doors. Marco learned not to ask questions about the business. He learned that certain rooms were off limits, that certain phone calls meant Dante would disappear for hours or days, that the men who worked for Dante treated Marco with a strange mixture of respect and caution, as if he were something precious and breakable. Antonio became a familiar presence, always professional, always watching. Nico drove Marco to appointments, to the rare occasions when he left the estate. Sophia cooked meals and made sure Marco had everything he needed. It was a household built on loyalty and silence, and Marco fit into it like a puzzle piece he hadn't known was missing. But the piece was fragile. 2 months after Marco arrived, it shattered. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Marco was in the library, a room lined floor to ceiling with books he was slowly learning to read, working through a picture book with Dr. Chen when he heard shouting. Not normal conversation, but genuine anger, voices raised in a way he'd never heard in Dante's controlled household. Dr. Chen's expression tightened. "Stay here," she said firmly, then stood and closed the library door behind her as she left. Marco waited exactly 30 seconds before disobeying. He crept to the door, opened it a crack, and listened. The voices were coming from Dante's office down the hall. One was Dante, cold and controlled even in anger. The other was unfamiliar, younger, desperate. "You can't do this," the stranger was saying. "You don't understand what they'll do if I don't deliver." Dante's response was quiet, deadly. "What I understand is you made a deal that wasn't yours to make. You used my name, my reputation, to guarantee a shipment you had no authority over. I had no choice. The Russians were pushing into our territory. I needed leverage. So you invented leverage that didn't exist and put a target on my organization. Do you have any idea how many people could have died because of your stupidity?" The sound of something slamming, maybe a fist on a desk. "I ought to put you in the ground right now." Marco's heart hammered. He'd known, in an abstract way, that Dante's business was dangerous. But hearing the violence in his guardian's voice, the casual reference to killing, made it real in a way nothing else had. The younger voice started begging. "Please, Dante. I'll fix it. I'll make this right. Just give me time." Silence, long and terrible. Then Dante spoke, each word precise and final. "You have 48 hours to undo what you've done. If the Russians aren't satisfied, if they come for retaliation, you'll pray I kill you quickly. Now get out of my sight." Footsteps, rushed and panicked. The office door opened, and a man in his 20s stumbled out, his face pale and sweating. He nearly ran down the hallway, not even noticing Marco watching from the library door. Marco pulled back into the shadows, his mind racing. He'd seen fear before, plenty of it in his short life, but never like this. This was terror of someone who knew exactly what violence awaited him, who'd looked death in the face and been given a temporary reprieve. Marco retreated to his chair, picked up his book with shaking hands, and tried to focus on the words swimming across the page. Dr. Chen returned minutes later, her expression carefully neutral. "Everything's fine," she said, though her voice carried a tension that suggested otherwise. "Let's continue." They worked through the rest of the session, but Marco couldn't concentrate. The words blurred together, not from dyslexia but from the sick feeling in his stomach, the knowledge that the man who'd saved him, who'd promised to protect him, was also capable of putting people in the ground. That night at dinner, Dante seemed unchanged. He asked about Marco's tutoring session, listened to the report on his progress, discussed plans to visit a specialist in Milwaukee who worked with dyslexic children. He was attentive, present, almost fatherly. But Marco couldn't stop hearing the coldness in his voice from earlier, couldn't stop seeing the terrified face of the man who'd begged for more time. After dinner, as Sophia cleared the plates, Marco gathered his courage. "Can I ask you something?" Dante set down his wine glass, giving Marco his full attention. "The man who was here today. The one you were yelling at. What's going to happen to him?" Dante's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "You heard that." It wasn't a question. Marco nodded. "Some of it." Dante was silent for a long moment, considering his response. When he spoke, his voice carried the same careful honesty he'd used when explaining Marco's dyslexia. "That man made a mistake that could have gotten people killed. People I'm responsible for protecting. So I'm giving him a chance to fix it. If he does, he lives. If he doesn't, he faces consequences." "You mean you'll kill him?" The bluntness of the statement hung between them. Dante didn't flinch. "Possibly. Or someone under my authority will. This is the world I live in, Marco. I won't lie to you about that. But I need you to understand something. He leaned forward, his intensity focused entirely on the 7-year-old sitting across from him. The violence you heard today, the threats, the danger, none of that touches you. You're separate from this. Protected. Marco wanted to believe him. But he'd learned young that protection was conditional, that safety was temporary, that promises broke as easily as glass. What if someone comes after you? What if something happens and you can't protect me anymore? The question revealed more fear than Marco intended, but Dante didn't mock it or dismiss it. Instead, he stood, walked to where Marco sat, and crouched beside his chair the way he had in the airport months ago. If something happens to me, there are protocols in place. Antonio becomes your guardian. The house, the money, everything I have goes into a trust for you. You'll be provided for until you're an adult and beyond. I've made sure of it legally, irrevocably. You're not dependent on my survival, Marco. You're woven into the fabric of everything I've built. The promise should have comforted Marco, but instead it terrified him. Being woven into Dante's world meant being part of something dangerous, something where people made mistakes and paid with their lives, where violence was a tool as common as money or influence. But it also meant belonging, being claimed in a way Marco never had been before. He thought about the alternative: foster homes, temporary placements, adults who saw him as an obligation rather than a person. At least here, with Dante, he mattered. At least here, someone had chosen him deliberately. Okay, Marco said finally. Dante nodded, stood, and returned to his seat. They finished dinner in silence, both carrying weight neither could fully articulate. That night, Marco couldn't sleep. He lay in his enormous bed, staring at shadows on the ceiling, and thought about his mother. He wondered if she was clean now, if the facility had helped her, if she ever thought about the son she'd abandoned in an airport. He wondered if Grandma was in pain, if she was scared, if she knew that Marco was safe even though she was dying. He wondered about Luca, Dante's brother, the boy who'd been so broken by the world he'd chosen death over endurance. At some point, Sophia had left new books on his nightstand, picture books with large fonts designed for early readers. Marco turned on the bedside lamp and picked up the top one. The letters still moved, still danced, but Dr. Chen's techniques helped. He sounded out words slowly, painfully, his finger tracing under each line to keep his place. The story was about a lost dog who found a home. Simple, predictable, the kind of thing meant for much younger children. But Marco read it cover to cover, and when he finished, he felt something close to pride. 3 months ago, he couldn't have done this. 3 months ago, reading was torture, a reminder of everything he couldn't do. Now it was just hard, which was different. Hard meant possible. Hard meant maybe someday it wouldn't be hard anymore. He turned off the light and settled back into bed, the book clutched to his chest like a talisman. Outside his window, the estate's security lights cast geometric patterns across the lawn. Beyond the walls, Chicago breathed and moved, a city full of danger and opportunity in equal measure. Marco was learning to navigate this new world, learning its rules and rhythms, learning when to ask questions and when to stay silent. But there were things he didn't know, couldn't know. He didn't know that the man who'd begged Dante for mercy would fail to fix his mistake, would disappear 3 weeks later in a way that made it clear he'd face those consequences Dante had promised. He didn't know that Dante's enemies were circling, that bringing a child into his household had been seen by some as weakness, a vulnerability to exploit. He didn't know that in the complex chess game of organized crime, he'd become a piece worth capturing. The first hint of trouble came 6 weeks later. Marco was walking the estate grounds with Antonio, a routine they'd established. Antonio taught him things Dante didn't have time for: how to read people's body language, how to spot when someone was lying, how to stay aware of his surroundings. Never let anyone corner you, Antonio said as they walked past the gardens. Always know your exits. Why? Marco asked. I'm safe here, right? Antonio's expression was carefully neutral. Safe is relative. The boss has made you his responsibility, which means you're valuable. Valuable things attract attention. Before Marco could ask what he meant, Antonio's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face hardening. Inside. Now. The urgency in his voice made Marco obey instantly. They hurried back to the house, Antonio's hand on Marco's shoulder, guiding him quickly through the side entrance. Inside, the house was suddenly full of activity. Men Marco recognized as Dante's people moved with purpose, checking windows, speaking in rapid Italian, carrying things Marco couldn't identify. Sofia appeared and took Marco's hand. "Come with me, sweetheart." Quickly. She led him to a part of the house he'd never been before, downstairs to a basement level that was finished and comfortable but clearly designed for something specific. A safe room, Marco realized. Reinforced walls, supplies stocked on shelves, a communication system built into the wall. "You're going to stay here for a little while," Sofia said, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Carbone will come get you when it's safe." "What's happening?" Marco asked, fear sharp in his chest. Sofia knelt in front of him, her hands on his shoulders. "Nothing you need to worry about. Just some business that requires precautions. You're safe, Marco. That's what matters." She left, locking the door from the outside. Marco was alone in the safe room with his fear and his imagination, both running wild. He could hear muffled sounds from upstairs, voices, movement, but couldn't make out words. Time stretched, minutes feeling like hours. He sat on a small couch and tried to read one of the books someone had thoughtfully placed in the room, but the letters danced more than usual, his fear making concentration impossible. Finally, after what felt like forever but was probably only an hour, the door opened. Dante stood there, his suit jacket gone, his expression harder than Marco had ever seen it. "You're okay?" he asked, entering the room and closing the door behind him. Marco nodded. "What happened?" Dante sat heavily on the couch beside him, and for the first time since Marco had known him, the man looked tired. "Someone tried to use you to get to me. They sent a message suggesting they knew where you went to school, what route you took on walks, when you were vulnerable. It was a threat." The fear that had been simmering in Marco's chest exploded into full panic. "Are they coming for me?" "No," Dante said firmly. "The threat has been neutralized. The people responsible have been dealt with." But it made something clear. "You can't live a normal life, Marco. Not while you're under my protection. It's too dangerous." Marco felt something break inside him. He'd started to believe, stupidly, that maybe this could work. Maybe he could have a home, a guardian, something stable. But of course it couldn't last. Nothing ever lasted. "So what happens to me?" he asked, his voice flat. Dante looked at him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. "What happens is I teach you to protect yourself. You learn our ways, our rules, how to survive in this world. You grow up understanding both the danger and the power. And when you're old enough to choose, you decide if you want to stay or leave. But until then, you're mine to protect, and I don't fail in my responsibilities." The promise was heavy, binding. Marco understood, even at 7 years old, that he was being offered something rare. Not safety, exactly, but strength. Not a normal childhood, but a chance to become someone who couldn't be broken by the world. "Okay," Marco said again, and the word felt like a door closing on one life and opening to another. Dante stood, offered his hand, and pulled Marco to his feet. They left the safe room together, climbing back into the house that was both haven and fortress, both home and headquarters. And Marco understood, with a clarity beyond his years, that he'd been claimed by something larger than himself, absorbed into a world where love and violence weren't opposites but two sides of the same brutal coin. He was no longer the lost boy in the airport who couldn't read his boarding pass. He was becoming something else entirely, something shaped by Dante's protection and Dante's world, something dangerous and protected in equal measure. The question was whether that transformation would save him or destroy him. 10 years changed everything and nothing. Marco sat in the library where he'd once struggled through picture books, now reading contracts written in legal language so dense it would have broken his 7-year-old self. At 17, he was taller than Dante, lean and sharp-featured, with eyes that had learned to see threats before they materialized. The dyslexia remained, letters still performed their familiar dance, but Dr. Chen's techniques had become second nature. He'd adapted, overcome, transformed his supposed weakness into a different kind of strength. Reading slowly meant reading carefully. Missing obvious meanings meant finding hidden ones. The boy who couldn't read his boarding pass had become a young man who could decode the subtext in every conversation, every contract, every silence. Dante entered without knocking, a privilege only he maintained in Marco's space. Age had touched him too, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but the intensity remained undiminished. The Calabrese meeting is in an hour. Antonio thinks you should sit in. Marco set down the contract he'd been reviewing. And what do you think? Over the years, he'd learned that Antonio's opinions and Dante's didn't always align. Dante considered the question with his usual precision. I think you're ready. I also think the Calabrese family will test you, push boundaries to see if my protection of you is weakness or strength. How you handle that will determine whether you're seen as my heir or my liability. Heir. The word had been circling for months now, unspoken but present in every interaction, every lesson, every decision Dante involved Marco in. At 17, Marco stood at a crossroads. In a year, he'd be legally an adult. He could leave, use the considerable trust fund Dante had established, disappear into a normal life. Or he could stay, accept the mantle being offered, become not just Dante's ward but his successor. The choice should have been obvious. Normal life meant safety, legality, freedom from the violence that had colored his adolescence. But normal life also meant leaving behind the only person who'd ever chosen him, who'd seen a broken boy in an airport and decided he was worth saving. Then let's show them strength, Marco said. The meeting took place in a private room at a restaurant the Carbone family owned, a front for more lucrative operations but legitimate enough to host business dinners. The Calabrese contingent arrived precisely on time. 3 men in expensive suits, their leader a silver-haired patriarch named Vittorio who'd been in the business longer than Marco had been alive. They assessed Marco immediately, cataloging his youth, his presence at Dante's side, the deference Dante's men showed him. Vittorio smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. So this is the famous Marco. The boy from the airport. I've heard stories. His English carried a thick Italian accent, each word deliberate. You've done well, Dante. Taking in strays, raising them to be useful. Very charitable. The insult was subtle but clear. Stray. Charity case. Marco felt Antonio stiffen beside him, felt the shift in the room's energy as Dante's men recognized the disrespect. But Dante's expression remained neutral, and Marco understood this was his test, not Dante's. He met Vittorio's gaze directly. Mr. Calabrese, I appreciate your concern for my origins. It's true I started with nothing. But that's taught me to value what I've built, to understand that loyalty isn't inherited, it's earned. Unlike some who mistake their birthright for competence. The silence that followed was absolute. Vittorio's smile froze, his eyes hardening. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. The boy has teeth. Good. I was worried Dante had made you soft. The meeting proceeded, negotiations over territory and percentages, the usual dance of organized crime. Marco participated when appropriate, stayed silent when necessary, and watched everything. He saw how Vittorio tested boundaries, how his lieutenants took cues from his expressions, how power flowed through small gestures and loaded pauses. By the end, they'd reached an agreement that satisfied both families. As the Calabrese contingent prepared to leave, Vittorio paused beside Marco. Your guardian has built something impressive. If you inherit it, remember that empires fall when their rulers forget what violence created them. Compassion is admirable in civilians. In our world, it's fatal. After they left, Dante dismissed everyone except Marco. They sat in the empty restaurant, the table littered with the remains of dinner neither had eaten much of. You did well, Dante said. Vittorio respects strength. You showed him you won't be intimidated. Marco traced patterns in the condensation on his water glass. He also showed me something. He's afraid of what I represent. A successor who wasn't raised in this world, who might change things. Dante's expression flickered with something Marco couldn't quite read. Would you? Change things? The question hung between them, weighted with 10 years of unspoken conversations. Marco thought about the violence he'd witnessed growing up in Dante's household. The people who'd disappeared, the threats that materialized and were neutralized, the constant awareness that their empire was built on activities that destroyed lives. He thought about the man who'd begged for mercy and received only a deadline. About the security threats that had resulted in bodies Marco never saw but knew about. About the careful separation Dante had maintained between Marco's life and the darkest aspects of the business. I don't know, Marco admitted. Part of me wants to believe we could be different. Run operations that don't require killing, find ways to profit without destroying communities. But another part knows that's naive. This world has rules. Breaking them means death. Dante leaned back, studying Marco with an intensity that felt archaeological, like he was excavating layers of meaning. When I found you in that airport, you reminded me of Luca. But you're not Luca. He was gentle, sensitive, broken by cruelty. You've been tempered by it. You've learned to navigate violence without becoming violent yourself. That's rare. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. The empire I built required brutality. I won't apologize for that. But maybe the empire you build can be different. Not soft, but strategic. Not cruel, but calculated. Evolution, not revolution. The permission implicit in those words stunned Marco. Dante wasn't just offering him a position, he was offering him the freedom to transform it. Why? Marco asked. Why give me that kind of power? Dante's expression softened in a way Marco had seen only a handful of times over the years. Because you're the best thing I've ever created. Not my business, not my reputation. You. The boy who couldn't read became someone who reads situations better than anyone I know. You've taken every disadvantage and turned it into strength. If I can't trust you with my legacy, I can't trust anyone. The words cracked something open in Marco's chest. For 10 years, he'd wondered if he was truly wanted or merely useful. If Dante's protection was love or obligation. Now, hearing the raw honesty in his guardian's voice, Marco understood it was both and neither. It was something more complicated, forged in violence and choice and the simple act of one person refusing to abandon another. That night, Marco couldn't sleep. He left his room and wandered the mansion's halls, past familiar doors and shadows that no longer frightened him. He found himself in Dante's office, where his guardian often worked late into the night. The desk held the usual detritus of power, contracts, phones, files stamped confidential. But also, in a frame Marco had never noticed before, a photograph. 2 boys, maybe 8 and 13, laughing at something outside the camera's view. The younger one had Dante's features softened by childhood, that same intensity already visible in his eyes. The older boy wore an expression of pure joy, unself-conscious and bright. Luca. Marco picked up the frame, studying the brother Dante had lost, the ghost that had shaped his guardian's every decision. He understood now why Dante had stopped in that airport 10 years ago. Not charity, not kindness, but a desperate attempt to rewrite history, to save one lost boy because he'd failed to save another. I keep that hidden most of the time. Dante's voice came from the doorway, startling Marco. But tonight, after the meeting, I took it out. Wanted to remember why I started this. He entered the office, poured 2 glasses of whiskey from the decanter on his desk. He handed one to Marco, who'd been drinking occasionally in Dante's presence for the past year, a ritual of trust. They sat in matching leather chairs, the photograph between them. Do you think he'd approve? Marco asked. Of what you built? Of me? Dante considered the question with his usual precision. Luca was kind. He believed in redemption, in second chances. He would have loved that I saved you. But he would have hated how I built the empire that made it possible. He never understood that sometimes you have to become what you hate to protect what you love. Marco sipped the whiskey, feeling it burn down his throat, warming him from the inside. I've been thinking about what Vittorio said. About compassion being fatal in this world. But you showed me compassion. You chose to help when everyone else walked past. That choice saved my life. So maybe compassion isn't weakness. Maybe it's the only thing that makes this bearable. Dante's eyes reflected something Marco had never seen there before. Tears, unshed but present, threatening to spill over. You're wiser than I was at your age. Wiser than I am now. He set down his glass, his hands unsteady in a way that terrified Marco more than any threat ever had. I need to tell you something. The doctors found it 6 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Treatment might buy me a year, maybe less. I've decided not to pursue it. The words didn't make sense at first. Marco's brain rejected them, tried to reorganize them into something less devastating. But Dante's expression was steady, resigned, already grieving his own death. No, Marco said, the words sharp and desperate. No, you fight this. You get treatment. You don't just give up. Dante shook his head slowly. I'm tired, Marco. I've spent 40 years building an empire on violence and fear. I've done terrible things, made choices that haunt me every night. The only good decision I've made was pulling you out of that airport. If I die knowing you'll inherit everything I've built and make it better, that's enough. That's more than I deserve. Marco stood abruptly, the chair scraping against hardwood. You don't get to do this. You don't get to save me and then leave. That's not how this works. That's exactly how this works, Dante said, his voice gentle but firm. I saved you because you deserved saving. Now you save yourself by becoming who you're meant to be. With or without me. The anger that flooded Marco was hot and terrible, years of carefully controlled emotion breaking free. You're a coward. You spent 10 years teaching me to be strong, to face threats, to never back down. And now you're backing down from the biggest fight of your life because you're tired? Because you think you don't deserve to live? That's bullshit. Dante flinched, the word landing like a physical blow. Marco, no. You listen. You don't get to decide you're not worth saving. You don't get to give up. Because if you die, you prove Vittorio right. You prove that compassion is fatal, that caring about someone makes you weak. And I refuse to believe that. I refuse to accept that the man who saved me can't be saved himself. The tears Dante had been holding back finally spilled over, tracking down his face in the dim office light. Marco had never seen him cry, had never imagined this pillar of strength could crack. But here he was, breaking apart in front of the boy he'd raised, the facade of control finally shattering. I don't know how to be saved, Dante whispered. I don't know how to be anything except what I am. Marco knelt in front of Dante's chair, taking his guardian's hands in his own, feeling how they trembled. Then let me help you learn. You saved a 7-year-old who couldn't read. Let me save a 47-year-old who forgot how to hope. That's fair, isn't it? Dante laughed through his tears, the sound broken but genuine. When did you become the adult in this relationship? About 10 minutes ago, when you told me you were giving up. They sat in that moment, both crying now, both carrying grief for different losses and different futures. Finally, Dante spoke. If I do this, if I fight, you need to understand something. Treatment will make me weak. While I'm sick, you'll have to step up, take over operations, prove to people like Vittorio that you're capable. It won't be easy. Marco nodded. I know. But you taught me everything I need to know. And what I don't know, Antonio can help with. We'll make it work. Dante studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. I'll try. For you. The promise was small, fragile, but it was enough. Over the following months, Marco learned what it meant to lead. Dante started treatment, aggressive chemotherapy that left him weak and sick but alive. Marco attended meetings alone, made decisions he'd only observed before, navigated the complex politics of organized crime with Antonio as his guide and Dante as his distant advisor. It wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, misjudged situations, occasionally showed the compassion Vittorio had warned against. But he also brought something new to the Carbone Empire. Where Dante had ruled through fear, Marco learned to rule through respect. He found ways to profit that didn't require destroying communities, negotiated truces that benefited all parties, slowly transformed the family's operations from purely criminal to quasi-legitimate. Some of the old guard resisted. Challenges came, threats materialized. But Marco had learned from the best. He knew when to show strength and when to show mercy, when to negotiate and when to eliminate threats. And always, Dante's training echoed in his decisions, the lessons absorbed over 10 years guiding him through situations that should have broken someone his age. 18 months after his diagnosis, Dante sat in the library where Marco had once struggled with picture books, watching his heir review contracts with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that words mattered. The treatment had been brutal, but scans showed the cancer in remission. Dante was thinner, grayer, marked by his fight with death in ways that wouldn't fade. But he was alive. "You've done well," Dante said, his voice carrying the weakness of someone who'd been dismantled and rebuilt. "Better than I expected. The family's stronger than when I handed it over." Marco looked up from the contract, setting it aside. "We're different. Not stronger, just different. More legitimate, less violent. Some people hate it, think we've gone soft. But profit's up, and fewer people are dying. I'll take that trade." Dante nodded slowly. "Vittorio died last week. Heart attack in his sleep. His sons are fighting over succession. They're asking for your mediation." The request surprised Marco. A year ago, the Calabrese family had viewed him as Dante's pet project, inexperienced and idealistic. Now they wanted his guidance. "Will you help me prepare?" Marco asked. Dante smiled, the expression still rare but warmer than it used to be. "You don't need my help anymore, Marco. You haven't for months. I'm just the old man in the library now, watching you build something better than what I created." The words should have felt like praise, but they carried an edge of melancholy, the recognition that one generation was ending and another beginning. "I want to show you something," Marco said, standing. He led Dante to his room, to a section of wall he'd slowly filled over the years. Photographs, dozens of them. Marco at 8, reading his first full book. Marco at 10, learning to shoot at the range Antonio had built on the estate. Marco at 13, sitting beside Dante at his first major negotiation. Marco at 16, graduating from the private school Dante had enrolled him in despite the challenges. And new ones, added recently. Marco at 17, leading his first meeting alone. Marco at 18, standing in front of the empire he'd inherited and transformed. But in the center, larger than the rest, was a different photograph. 2 boys in an airport, one crying, one kneeling beside him. A stranger who'd stopped to help. The beginning of everything. "I had security pull that from the airport cameras," Marco said. "From the day you saved me. I wanted to remember where we started." Dante stared at the photograph for a long time, his expression complex. "I didn't save you, Marco. You saved yourself. I just gave you the opportunity." Marco shook his head. "No. You taught me that compassion isn't weakness. That choosing to help someone, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's dangerous, is the most powerful thing you can do. Everything I've built, every decision I've made, comes back to that moment. To you choosing to stop when everyone else walked past." They stood together in front of the photographs, guardian and heir, 2 people bound by a choice made in an airport 10 years ago. The empire Dante had built through violence was slowly transforming into something else under Marco's leadership. Not perfect, not pure, but evolving. Learning that strength and compassion weren't opposites but complements. Outside, Chicago glittered in the darkness, millions of lives intersecting and diverging, each one carrying their own weight of choices and consequences. In this mansion built on crime and blood and power, two people who'd found each other in desperation had created something neither expected. Not a typical family, but family nonetheless. Broken pieces that had somehow fit together, creating something stronger than either could have built alone. Marco would continue leading, would face challenges and threats, would make mistakes and learn from them. Dante would recover fully or not, would advise or simply observe, would eventually face the mortality he'd tried to embrace prematurely. But tonight, they stood together in front of a decade of memories, and understood that salvation wasn't a single moment but a choice made repeatedly, day after day, to show up for someone who needed you. The boy who couldn't read had learned to read the world. The man who'd forgotten how to hope had learned it again. And the empire built on violence had discovered, slowly and painfully, that there were other ways to survive, other kinds of strength worth cultivating. It wasn't redemption, exactly. Some things couldn't be redeemed, some violence couldn't be undone. But it was transformation, the kind that happens when one person refuses to walk past another's pain, when compassion becomes not weakness but revolution. 10 years ago, Marco had held a boarding pass he couldn't read and asked a stranger for help. That stranger had given him everything: safety, education, purpose, and the space to become himself. Now Marco was giving something back, showing Dante that the life he'd built on darkness could still grow toward light, that the man who'd saved a lost boy could himself be saved. They were both broken, both marked by violence and loss, both carrying weight that would never fully lift. But they were also both here, alive and together, having chosen each other repeatedly across a decade of impossible circumstances. And that choice, renewed day after day, was the most powerful thing either of them had ever done. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.